Control is the grandest illusion that empires tell themselves. We map our borders with light years and name our conquests with ancient words, and we believe, truly believe, that the stars themselves bow to our authority. For 8,000 years, the ascendancy of the eternal throne held dominion over the Verath sector. 47 species, 900 inhabited worlds, trillions of subjects who lived and died beneath our benevolent gaze.
We called ourselves eternal, and for 80 centuries nothing in the cosmos dared to contradict us. Then Earth arrived, and eternity ended in a single afternoon.
My name is Caliph Vryn, and I am, or was, the High Chronicler of the Eternal Throne. For 600 years I recorded the history of our ascendancy, documenting its triumphs and its inevitable expansion. I wrote of conquered worlds with pride. I described the integration of lesser species as a gift we bestowed upon the primitive. I believed every word I inscribed because believing was easier than questioning, and questioning was not something the ascendancy encouraged.
I am writing this account now because the truth must be preserved, even when the truth brings shame. Especially when the truth brings shame. What happened to the ascendancy was not a tragedy inflicted upon us by cruel fate. It was a consequence, a reckoning for sins we had committed for millennia while telling ourselves we were righteous.
And the humans were simply the ones who finally presented the bill.
The Verath sector had been ours since before most species in the galaxy had developed written language. Our ancestors had risen on a world of savage beauty, where survival required intelligence, cooperation, and above all, the willingness to dominate before being dominated. We evolved as apex predators, and when we reached the stars, we carried that predatory nature with us.
The ascendancy was not built on diplomacy or trade, it was built on conquest. World after world fell beneath our fleets, their populations absorbed into our empire as subjects, laborers, or, in the early days, resources. We refined our methods over millennia, learning that willing slaves are more productive than resentful ones, that the appearance of benevolence costs nothing and gains everything. By the time I was born, the ascendancy had perfected its system. Subject species were granted autonomy in their daily lives, allowed to maintain their cultures and traditions, permitted to believe they had meaningful choices. But the throne controlled the fleet. The throne controlled interstellar travel. The throne controlled the technology that made civilization possible. And any species that forgot their place was reminded, firmly and finally, that the ascendancy's patience had limits.
I grew up believing this was the natural order. The strong ruled, the weak served. It was not cruelty, it was simply reality. Our philosophers had developed elaborate justifications for our dominion, arguing that the ascendancy brought order to chaos, that our subjects benefited from our protection, that without our guiding hand, the sector would dissolve into barbarism and war.
We believed these things because we needed to believe them. The alternative, that we were simply tyrants who had never faced a force capable of stopping us, was unthinkable. I first learned of humanity through routine administrative reports, the kind that crossed my desk by the thousands each cycle. A new species had been detected at the sector's edge, occupying a small yellow star system that our charts had marked as uninhabited. They called themselves humans, and our initial assessments described them as unremarkable, bipedal, relatively short-lived, confined to a single world with no faster-than-light capability. The recommendation was standard: observe, evaluate, and when they developed sufficient technology,
Initiate integration protocols. Another primitive species to be guided into the ascendancy's embrace. I filed the report and forgot about it within the hour.
That was 300 years ago. In hindsight, that casual dismissal may have been the most consequential mistake of my career. The updates on humanity arrived sporadically over the following centuries, each one slightly more concerning than the last. They had developed faster than light travel, not through the gravitational manipulation we used, but through some form of spatial compression that our scientists struggled to understand. They had established colonies on nearby worlds with a speed that seemed almost frantic. They had made contact with other species at the sector's edge and formed what they called alliances, voluntary associations based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical submission.
The throne's response to these developments was dismissive. Humans were too far from our core territories to matter. Their technology, while novel, was clearly inferior to our own. Their alliances would crumble at the first sign of pressure, as all such naive arrangements eventually did. They were a curiosity, nothing more, a footnote in the ascendancy's eternal history.
I shared this assessment. I had no reason not to. In 600 years of recording history, I had never seen anything challenge the throne's supremacy. Why would this small species from a backwater system be any different?
The first sign of trouble came not from humanity, but from within the ascendancy itself.
The Corveth were one of our oldest subject species, integrated into the Empire nearly 4,000 years ago. They had long since accepted their place in our hierarchy, serving as administrators and technicians, their natural aptitude for organization making them valuable contributors to the ascendancy's bureaucracy. They had never shown any inclination toward rebellion. They had never needed to.
Then, without warning, the Corveth homeworld went silent. The initial reports suggested a communications failure, unusual but not unprecedented. When our patrol vessels arrived to investigate, they found something unprecedented indeed. The Corveth had declared independence. Their orbital platforms we had built and maintained, had been modified with weapon systems we did not recognize. Their planetary shields had been enhanced beyond anything our technology should have allowed. And when the patrol commander demanded their surrender, the Corveth response was a single word.
No.
The throne's reaction was swift and overwhelming. 3 battle fleets, nearly 1,000 warships were dispatched to crush the rebellion and make an example that would discourage any other species from similar foolishness. I watched the departure ceremony from the chronicle halls, recording the throne's confident pronouncements about the swift justice that would be delivered. The fleets never returned. We received fragmentary reports in the following days. The Corveth's new weapons were unlike anything in our databases. Ships that should have been invulnerable were being disabled or destroyed by technologies that seemed to ignore our shields entirely. Our commanders reported enemy vessels that moved with impossible speed, that appeared and disappeared without warning, that coordinated their attacks with a precision that suggested artificial intelligence far beyond our own capabilities. And then, in the final transmissions before all contact was lost, a single phrase that I would hear many more times in the cycles to come: human pattern weapons detected. The throne refused to believe it at first. Humanity was a minor species, confined to a handful of systems at the sector's edge. They had no quarrel with the ascendancy. We had never even made formal contact with them. The idea that they might be arming our subjects, providing them with weapons capable of defeating our fleets, seemed absurd. But the evidence accumulated with terrible speed. The Corveth rebellion spread. Other species, the Yethrani, the Morvac,
the Telesi, began to rise against us. Each rebellion followed the same pattern: communications blackout, followed by the appearance of technologies that should not have existed, followed by the destruction of any forces sent to restore order.
And always, in the final moments before our ships went dark, that same phrase, human pattern weapons detected. 6 months after the Corvette Rebellion began, the throne finally acknowledged what the Chronicle's records made undeniable. Humanity was not merely arming our subjects, they were systematically dismantling the ascendancy from within, providing every species that had ever chafed under our rule with the means to break free. The Eternal Throne, which had ruled for 8,000 years, was losing a war it had not even known it was fighting. I was summoned to the throne chamber for the first time in my career when the full scale of the catastrophe became clear. The chamber itself was a monument to our power, a vast space carved from the heart of a captured asteroid, its walls lined with the preserved banners of every species we had ever conquered. For millennia, ambassadors and supplicants had stood in this room, awed by the weight of history that surrounded them. Now the eternal sovereign sat upon the throne looking like a being who had just discovered that history could flow in more than one direction.
"Chronicler Vryn," the sovereign said, and even her voice, normally rich with absolute authority, carried notes of uncertainty I had never heard before. "You have studied humanity. You have read the reports, the analyses, the assessments. Tell me what we are facing."
I hesitated. The truth was that I had studied humanity, and what I had learned terrified me far more than the weapons they had provided to our former subjects.
"Sovereign," I began carefully, "the humans are not what our initial assessments suggested. They are not a primitive species that stumbled upon advanced technology. They are something else."
"Explain."
Their history is one of continuous struggle, war, disease, famine, environmental collapse. They have faced extinction-level crises repeatedly, and each time they have not merely survived, but emerged stronger. They are a species that thrives on adversity, that learns from it, that uses it as fuel for growth.
I pulled up data on my tablet, records I had compiled in the frantic cycles since the rebellion began. In the 300 years since we first detected them, they have advanced technologically at a rate that our scientists describe as impossible. They went from primitive chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel in less than a century.
They developed artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and weapons technologies that in some cases surpass our own, all while we were dismissing them as insignificant. How, the sovereign leaned forward, how could they have advanced so quickly without resources, without guidance, without the accumulated knowledge of an older civilization? They had something else, Sovereign, something we lack. I took a breath. They had pressure. They had scarcity. They had constant competition, both with their environment and with each other. Where we grew complacent in our dominion, they were forced to innovate simply to survive. Every generation faced new challenges, and every generation developed new solutions. They did not have the luxury of stagnation. The sovereign was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You are saying that our strength made us weak." "I am saying, Sovereign, that we have not faced a true challenge in 8,000 years. And in that time, humanity faced nothing but challenges. They are hardened in ways we cannot imagine. And now they have decided to challenge us." "No, Sovereign," I shook my head.
That is what I find most disturbing. Based on everything I have learned, humanity has not attacked us. They have simply empowered others to resist us. They are not conquering our territory. They are not claiming our resources. They are simply ensuring that we can no longer hold what we took by force.
Why? What do they want?
I had asked myself that question countless times. The answer I had reached was not one the sovereign would want to hear.
I believe, Sovereign, that they want justice, and they are patient enough to let us defeat ourselves.
The war, though calling it a war implies a conflict between equals, lasted another 18 months. In that time, the Ascendancy lost everything it had spent 8 millennia building.
The rebellions spread like wildfire across our territory. Species we had controlled for thousands of years suddenly possessed weapons capable of matching our best warships. Our supply lines collapsed as world after world declared independence. Our fleets, accustomed to fighting primitive opponents who could barely scratch our shields, found themselves facing coordinated resistance that exploited every weakness in our tactics. And through it all, humanity remained almost invisible. We knew they were behind the rebellions. The technological signatures were unmistakable, but we could not find them. Our scouts reported human vessels at the sector's edge, always watching, never engaging directly. Our intelligence operatives discovered human advisors working with rebel factions, providing training and strategic guidance, but whenever we moved to capture them, they vanished.
They were ghosts, phantoms, a presence that shaped every battle without ever appearing on the battlefield. The throne's response grew increasingly desperate. We stripped defenses from loyal worlds to reinforce collapsing fronts, leaving those worlds vulnerable to new rebellions. We conscripted subject species into our fleets, only to watch them defect at the first opportunity. We developed new weapons, new tactics, new strategies, but every innovation we introduced, the rebels seemed to have already anticipated and countered. It was as if someone was watching our every move and informing our enemies before we could act. Later, I would learn that this was exactly what was happening. Humanity had penetrated our communications networks centuries ago. They had been listening to us, studying us, understanding us, all while we dismissed them as primitive and irrelevant. By the time we recognized them as a threat, they knew us better than we knew ourselves. The end came not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet collapse. One by one, our remaining fleet commanders surrendered or defected. One by one, our loyal worlds declared neutrality or joined the growing coalition of free species. The eternal throne, which had ruled the sector for 80 centuries, found itself controlling nothing but the homeworld and a handful of nearby systems. And then, finally, humanity arrived. I will never forget the moment their fleet appeared in our home system. I was in the Chronicle halls when the alarms sounded, recording what I believed would be the Ascendancy's final hours. I rushed to the observation deck, along with hundreds of other officials and citizens who wanted to witness the end firsthand. What I saw defied everything I thought I understood about humanity.
Their fleet was not large by the standards we had once commanded. Perhaps 200 vessels, arranged in a formation that our tactical systems struggled to analyze. The ships themselves were unremarkable in appearance, angular, functional, devoid of the ornamental grandeur that characterized Ascendancy vessels. They looked like tools rather than symbols of power.
But it was not their appearance that struck me. It was their movement, their coordination, the way 200 ships acted as a single entity, adjusting their positions in real time with a precision that suggested not just automation, but something approaching collective consciousness. Our remaining defenders, a few dozen vessels crewed by those still loyal to the throne, scrambled to form a defensive line, but they looked like children playing at war compared to the force they faced.
The human fleet did not attack.
They simply stopped, waiting, patient. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Our defenders held their positions, weapons charged, shields raised, ready for an assault that never came. The human fleet remained motionless, a silent presence that radiated quiet confidence. They had crossed the sector, armed our subjects, destroyed our empire, and now they waited, as if the timing of what came next was entirely within their control.
Which, of course, it was. Finally, a single human vessel broke formation and approached our orbital defenses. It was small, barely larger than a shuttle, and it moved slowly, almost ceremonially. When it reached communication range, it broadcast a simple message on all frequencies.
This is Captain Elena Reyes of the United Earth Coalition vessel Perspective. We request permission to dock and discuss terms for the peaceful resolution of this conflict. We intend no hostility. We are prepared to wait as long as necessary for your response.
The sovereign, watching from the throne chamber, had no real choice. Our defenses could not stop them. Our empire had crumbled. Refusing to negotiate would only delay the inevitable while costing more lives. Permission was granted, and for the first time in 300 years of observation, a human set foot in the heart of Ascendancy space.
I was present at the first meeting between Captain Reyes and the Eternal Sovereign. As High Chronicler, it was my duty to record the moment for posterity, though what posterity would look like after this day I could not imagine.
Captain Reyes was not what I expected. Our intelligence had portrayed humans as aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous, a species whose violent history made them fundamentally untrustworthy. The woman who entered the throne chamber was none of these things. She was calm, poised. Her movements were measured, her expression neutral but not hostile. She wore a simple uniform without decoration or rank insignia beyond a small emblem on her collar. She carried no visible weapons. She moved through the ancient chamber, past the banners of conquered species, beneath the weight of 8,000 years of imperial history, with a quiet confidence that suggested she was exactly where she intended to be.
When she reached the appropriate distance from the throne, she stopped and inclined her head respectfully, not a bow of submission, I had seen enough of those to recognize the difference, but an acknowledgment between equals.
"Eternal Sovereign," she said. Her voice was clear, carrying easily through the vast chamber. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this situation is not one you anticipated, and I want to assure you that we have not come here as conquerors."
The sovereign's response was cold. "You have armed our subjects. You have destroyed our fleets. You have torn apart an empire that stood for 8 millennia. What would you call yourselves if not conquerors?"
Liberators. Captain Reyes did not flinch from the sovereign's anger, though I understand you may not see it that way. From your perspective, we have dismantled something ancient and powerful. From our perspective, and from the perspective of the 47 species who lived under your rule, we have ended something that should never have existed in the first place.
You know nothing of what we built, the order we maintained, the chaos we prevented.
"We know everything." Captain Reyes's voice remained steady.
We have studied your ascendancy for 3 centuries. We have read your histories, analyzed your policies, interviewed countless individuals from your subject species. We know how you rose to power. We know how you maintained it. We know about the rebellions you crushed, the species you exterminated, the cultures you erased because they refused to submit.
We know about Verith 3, she said quietly, the species that lived there before you decided their world would make a better mining colony. 12 billion sentient beings, Sovereign. An entire civilization wiped from existence because they occupied territory you wanted. Did you think no one would remember?
The Sovereign had no response. I had no response. Verith III was not something we discussed in the Chronicles. It was not something we discussed at all. It had happened 6,000 years ago, long before my birth, and the records had been sealed by sovereigns who preferred that certain truths remain buried.
But the humans knew. They had found the truth despite our efforts to hide it, and they had not forgotten.
Why? I heard myself ask the question before I could stop myself. The Sovereign shot me a furious look. A chronicler did not speak uninvited in the throne chamber, but Captain Reyes turned to me with what seemed like genuine interest.
Why what, chronicler? Why do you care? I stepped forward, propriety forgotten. Verith 3 happened before your species existed. The crimes of the Ascendancy, none of them were committed against humanity. You had no stake in this sector, no grievance to avenge, no territory to claim. You could have remained in your own space, building your civilization, ignoring what happened here. Why involve yourselves in matters that do not concern you?
Captain Reyes studied me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had softened.
Do you know the history of my species, chronicler?
Some of it. Your world's conflicts, your near-extinction events, your remarkable rate of technological advancement.
Then you know that for most of our history, we did exactly what you suggest. We remained in our own territories. We focused on our own problems. When one group of humans was being oppressed or exterminated by another, the rest of us found reasons not to intervene. It wasn't our concern. It was happening far away. Getting involved was too costly, too risky, too complicated.
She walked slowly toward me as she spoke, her footsteps echoing in the silent chamber.
We learned, chronicler, slowly, painfully, across centuries of bloodshed and suffering, we learned that indifference has a cost of its own, that evil ignored does not remain contained, that when we allow others to be oppressed without consequence, we are not avoiding conflict, we are merely postponing it, and ensuring that when it finally arrives, it will be far worse than it needed to be.
She stopped a few feet from me. Up close, I could see the lines around her eyes, the gray at her temples. She was older than I had initially thought, not ancient by my species' standards, but old for a human. A lifetime of experiences was written in her face.
We involved ourselves, she said, because we have learned that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good beings to do nothing. Because the Verith III genocide was not ancient history to the species who still remember it. Because 47 civilizations were living under your throne's shadow, and they deserved the chance to live free.
And if we had not been, if the Ascendancy had been benevolent, if we had ruled justly, then we would not be here. She said it simply, without drama. We spent 3 centuries watching, chronicler, studying, hoping that we were wrong about what we saw. We did not want this conflict. We do not enjoy dismantling civilizations, even civilizations built on conquest.
But we reached a point where we could no longer pretend that your ascendancy would reform itself, and we could no longer justify leaving billions of sentient beings under its control.
The sovereign's voice cut through the chamber. So you appointed yourselves judges of the galaxy, arbiters of justice. You decided, unilaterally, that our civilization was unworthy and acted accordingly.
Yes, Captain Reyes turned back to face the throne. We did, and I will not pretend that we have the right to make such judgments, or that our own history is free of similar crimes. Humanity has committed atrocities that rival anything in your chronicles. We are not better than you, Sovereign. We are simply further along the path. We have had our reckonings. We have faced the consequences of our own tyrannies and survived them.
And we have learned, at great cost, that empires built on subjugation always fall. Always. The only question is how much suffering they cause before they do.
And what now? The sovereign's voice was bitter. You have destroyed our empire. Will you destroy us as well? Complete the reckoning you believe we deserve?
No, Captain Reyes shook her head. That is not why we are here. We did not come to punish you. We came to offer you a choice.
She gestured, and a holographic display materialized in the air between her and the throne. It showed the Vareth sector, not as it had been under ascendancy control, but as it was now. Dozens of independent territories, each marked with the colors of a newly sovereign species. Trade routes connecting them in a web of voluntary commerce. Defense agreements binding them together against external threats.
The sector is reorganizing itself, Captain Reyes explained. The species you once controlled are forming new alliances, new partnerships, new governments. They are doing this themselves. We have not imposed any structure on them. They are deciding, for the first time in millennia, what they want their civilizations to look like.
She manipulated the display, zooming in on the Ascendancy's remaining territory, their homeworld and a handful of nearby systems, a tiny fragment of what had once been the largest empire in the sector.
This is what remains under your direct control. Your homeworld, your core systems, your people. No one is going to take these from you. No one is going to invade or occupy or impose terms of surrender. You are free to govern yourselves as you see fit.
Free. The sovereign laughed bitterly. Confined to a handful of systems when we once ruled 900 worlds, you call this freedom?
I call it consequence. Captain Reyes' voice hardened slightly. Those 900 worlds were never yours, Sovereign. You took them by force and held them through fear. Now the beings who actually live on those worlds have chosen differently. That is freedom, for them, if not for you.
She deactivated the display and clasped her hands behind her back. The choice we are offering is simple. You can accept this new reality and begin the process of building a different kind of civilization, one based on trade rather than tribute, cooperation rather than control. You have knowledge, technology, resources that other species will want. You can exchange these things voluntarily, as equals, and rebuild your prosperity through means that do not require subjugation. Or you can refuse. You can cling to dreams of empire, to the belief that you have a right to rule others, to the conviction that the eternal throne must be restored, and if you do, she paused, we will not attack you. We will not need to. Your former subjects will never allow you to rebuild your power. Every species in this sector now has the means to defend itself against you. Any attempt at reconquest will fail, and fail bloodily.
You will destroy yourselves pursuing an empire that can never exist again."
The throne chamber was silent. The sovereign sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Around the room, the gathered officials and advisors waited, uncertain what response was expected of them. I found myself thinking of the chronicles, of all the histories I had recorded, all the triumphs I had celebrated, all the conquered species I had dismissed as lesser beings who benefited from our rule. I thought of Veroth III, a world I had never known existed until moments ago, a civilization erased so completely that I had never even heard its name.
How many other names had been erased? How many other truths had been buried? How much of the history I had spent 6 centuries recording was lies built upon lies?
"May I speak, Sovereign?"
The words came from me before I realized I was going to say them. The sovereign's gaze snapped toward me, sharp with warning. A chronicler did not involve themselves in matters of state. A chronicler observed and recorded, that was all.
But something had changed in me. Something that had been building for 18 months of watching our empire crumble, of learning truths that had been hidden from my chronicles, of seeing the civilization I had served revealed for what it truly was.
"Speak, chronicler." The sovereign's voice was ice. "Since you have already forgotten your place once today, you might as well complete your disgrace." I stepped forward, past Captain Reyes, approaching the throne more closely than protocol allowed.
"I have served the Ascendancy for 600 years, Sovereign. I have devoted my life to preserving our history, to recording our achievements, to ensuring that future generations would understand the greatness of the Eternal Throne. And in all that time, I never questioned what I was told. I never looked beyond the official accounts. I never asked whether the chronicles I kept were true."
I felt the weight of every official in the room watching me. My career was ending with these words, possibly my life. But I could not stop.
I was wrong. We were all wrong. The humans have shown us what we could not or would not see for ourselves. The Ascendancy was not a gift we bestowed upon lesser species. It was a cage we built around them. And the chronicles I have kept for 6 centuries are not history. They are propaganda, lies we told ourselves to avoid confronting what we had become.
I turned to Captain Reyes. "You asked us to make a choice. I am making mine. I choose to face the truth, whatever it costs. And I hesitated, then pressed on. I asked to learn, to understand how your species overcame what we could not, to see if there is a path forward that does not require us to repeat the mistakes of our past."
Captain Reyes studied me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle.
"That is what we hoped someone would say." The aftermath of the Ascendancy's fall took years to unfold. The Eternal Sovereign eventually accepted the new reality, not gracefully, but pragmatically. She recognized that resistance was futile, and that clinging to imperial ambitions would only destroy what remained of our civilization. I did not remain to see it. 2 days after the meeting in the throne chamber, I departed with Captain Reyes aboard the Perspective, bound for human space. I had been granted a unique opportunity to observe human civilization firsthand, to study their history and their methods, to understand how a species that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times had emerged capable of dismantling an 8,000-year empire without fighting a single battle.
What I learned in the following months transformed everything I thought I knew.
Human civilization was not what I expected.
Their technology was advanced, yes, in many ways surpassing our own, but their worlds were not monuments to power. They were lived in, practical, designed for comfort and functionality rather than grandeur. Their cities sprawled in organic patterns rather than the rigid geometries we favored. Their buildings showed wear and age, not the eternal preservation that the ascendancy demanded of its structures.
And everywhere I went, I found diversity that would have been unthinkable under the throne. Humans who looked nothing alike, spoke different languages, followed different customs, held wildly different beliefs, yet somehow coexisted without the hierarchical structure that we had believed was necessary for social order. They argued, disagreed, competed, but they also cooperated, compromised, found ways to work together despite their differences.
When I asked Captain Reyes how this was possible, she laughed.
Possible? Chronicler, for most of our history, it wasn't possible at all. We spent thousands of years fighting each other over resources, territory, ideology. We built empires that collapsed. We committed genocides that we now study as warnings. We came within inches of annihilating ourselves more times than I can count.
Then how did you survive?
We learned. She was serious now, her humor fading. Every time we approached the brink, some of us recognized what was happening and pulled us back. Not all of us, never all of us, but enough. Enough humans remembered that we were one species, that our differences mattered less than our shared existence, that whatever conflicts divided us were not worth extinction.
She led me to a memorial garden aboard a station orbiting Earth's moon. Thousands of names were inscribed on black stone walls, arranged by date and event. Wars, disasters, atrocities that humans had inflicted upon each other throughout their history.
We do not forget, she said quietly. That is perhaps the most important thing we have learned. We preserve these memories, teach them to every generation, ensure that the mistakes of our past are never repeated. Not through censorship or propaganda, we tried that, and it always made things worse, but through honesty. Painful, uncomfortable honesty about what we have been capable of.
And that works? Simply remembering prevents you from repeating history?
Nothing prevents us completely. We still make mistakes, we still have conflicts and prejudices and leaders who try to exploit our worst instincts, but, she gestured at the memorial, when someone proposes something that echoes these walls, enough of us recognize it. Enough of us say no. The pattern is familiar enough that we can see it coming and choose differently. I spent a long time studying those walls, reading the names, the dates, the descriptions of events that humans had chosen to immortalize as warnings. Holocaust, Rwanda, the water wars, the collapse of 2157, catastrophe after catastrophe, each one recorded with unflinching detail.
The ascendancy would never have done this. We buried our crimes, erased them from history, pretended they had never happened. And in doing so, we ensured that we would repeat them, generation after generation, because no one remembered why they were wrong. Humanity remembered, and that memory had made them strong enough to end our empire. Over the following years, I watched the Vareth sector transform. The species that had lived under ascendancy rule built their own civilizations, made their own mistakes, developed their own solutions. Humanity helped where they were asked, provided technology and advice when requested, but never imposed their will. They were present, but not dominant, partners rather than masters.
Not everything went smoothly. There were conflicts between former subject species, old grudges that flared into violence, territories disputed by groups who had been forbidden from competing under ascendancy law. Humanity intervened in some of these situations, providing mediation or peacekeeping, but always with the lightest touch possible. They seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the power they wielded.
"You could control this sector if you wanted," I said to Captain Reyes, now Admiral Reyes, promoted for her role in the Ascendancy's dissolution. "You have the technology, the resources, the strategic position. You could build an empire to rival ours."
She shook her head. "We could, but we won't."
Why not? Your species clearly has the capability.
Capability is not the same as wisdom. She cut me off gently. We have learned, Chronicler, that empires are never worth the cost. Not for the conquered and not for the conquerors. They corrupt everyone they touch, turn liberators into oppressors, transform noble goals into justifications for atrocity. We will not walk that path. Not again.
Again?
She smiled sadly. Humanity has built empires too, many of them. We remember what they cost, what they did to those we conquered, and what they did to us. We will trade with this sector. We will ally with willing partners. We will defend those who ask for our help. But we will not rule. That much we have learned. It took me years to truly understand what she meant, to grasp that humanity's restraint was not weakness, but hard-won wisdom. They had the power to control the sector, to control the galaxy, perhaps, but they had chosen not to exercise it, not because they couldn't, but because they had learned what such control would cost. The Ascendancy had never learned that lesson. We had never needed to. For 8,000 years we had faced no consequence for our actions, no force capable of holding us accountable. And so we had grown cruel, complacent, convinced that our power made us righteous.
Then Earth arrived and showed us what accountability looked like.
I returned to my homeworld after 5 years among the humans. The Ascendancy was gone, not destroyed, but transformed. Our people still lived on our ancient territories, still maintained our culture and traditions, but we were no longer rulers. We were simply one species among many, trading and negotiating and competing as equals with civilizations we had once conquered.
Some of my people had accepted this new reality. Others still dreamed of restoration, of rebuilding the eternal throne, of reclaiming what they believed was rightfully ours. But each year, fewer voices called for empire, and more recognized that the old ways were gone forever.
I found the eternal sovereign in a modest residence near the ancient capital. She was old now, far older than she had been when the throne fell, and something had changed in her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I could not immediately identify.
"Chronicler," she said when I was announced, "I wondered if you would return." "I had to, Sovereign. This is my home."
"It is no longer yours to call sovereign." She gestured at the simple room around her. "I am simply an old woman now, Chronicler. The eternal throne exists only in memory."
I sat across from her, studying her face. The emotion I had not recognized earlier resolved itself. It was peace, not happiness. There was too much grief for happiness, but acceptance, understanding.
"You have changed," I said.
"I have had time to think." She looked toward a window that overlooked a garden. 5 years of powerlessness. 5 years of watching our former subjects build their own futures without us. It provides perspective.
"And what have you concluded?"
She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft.
"That we were wrong, not just mistaken,
Wrong. We built our civilization on the suffering of others and told ourselves it was natural, inevitable, even generous. We became monsters without ever realizing it, because there was no one powerful enough to show us what we had become. She turned to face me. The humans did not defeat us, Chronicler. They simply held up a mirror, and we could not bear what we saw. What do we do now?
We learn, she smiled, a genuine smile, perhaps the first I had ever seen from her. We remember. We build something new, something better. Not an empire, we have proven we cannot be trusted with that kind of power, but something worthy of the species we could become, instead of the species we were.
She reached out and took my hand, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable when she sat upon the throne. You spent 5 years among them, Chronicler. You saw how they live, how they remember, how they choose to be. Will you help us learn? Will you chronicle our redemption as you once chronicled our glory? I thought of Captain Admiral Reyes, of the memorial walls aboard the lunar station, of a species that had faced its own darkness and emerged determined never to return to it, of the choice they had made, not to rule, but to empower others to rule themselves.
Yes, I said, I will. They controlled the sector. For 8,000 years, the Ascendancy held dominion over 47 species and 900 worlds, and they believed it would last forever. They believed that control was their birthright, that power was proof of virtue, that their empire was eternal. Then Earth arrived, not as conquerors, though they could have conquered, not as rulers, though they could have ruled. They arrived as something the Ascendancy had never imagined, as liberators who wanted no tribute, no territory, no acknowledgement of superiority. They arrived to end an injustice that had lasted 8 millennia, and they asked nothing in return except that those they freed be allowed to choose their own paths.
I am old now, older than the eternal sovereign was when she fell, older than I ever expected to become. I have spent the last decades writing a new chronicle, not of conquest and glory, but of redemption and growth. I have recorded how my people struggled to become something different than what we had been, how we failed often, how we persisted anyway. And I have recorded the humans, their ships that come and go through our space, trading fairly, keeping peace when asked, watching always from a distance that is both respectful and somehow protective. They do not rule here, they never have, but their presence shapes everything, a reminder of what happens when empires forget that they exist at the sufferance of those they claim to control.
The sector is different now, messier, more chaotic, less efficient than it was under Ascendancy rule. Conflicts erupt and are resolved through negotiation rather than decree. Species make mistakes that a strong central authority might have prevented. It is, in many ways, harder to live in a galaxy of equals than one of masters and subjects.
But it is better. I see that clearly now. The freedom to fail is also the freedom to grow, to learn, to become something unexpected. The chaos of independence is also the vitality of genuine choice. What we lost in control, we gained in something far more valuable, the opportunity to become worthy of survival, rather than simply strong enough to enforce it.
Humanity taught us that. Not through conquest or domination, but through example. They showed us what a species that has faced its own darkness can become if it has the courage to remember and the wisdom to choose differently. They controlled the sector. Then Earth arrived, and the sector learned, at last, to control itself. I finish writing these words as the sun sets over my home world, a sunset I have watched 10,000 times, but which seems different now, more precious, more fragile, more worthy of protection.
Somewhere out there, human ships patrol the trade routes, keeping peace without keeping power. Somewhere out there, the species we once ruled are building their own futures, making their own choices, learning their own lessons. Somewhere out there, the galaxy continues without us at its center, and continues better for our absence.
The eternal throne is gone. The ascendancy is a memory. What remains is something smaller, but more honest, a single species among many, no longer masters of anything except ourselves.
And that, I have learned, is enough. That is more than enough. They controlled the sector. Then Earth arrived, and finally, the sector was free.